Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. Close your eyes for a moment and think about this. Right now, there are over 8 billion humans on Earth. We're in Tokyo and Toronto, Laros and London, scattered across every continent except Antarctica. And honestly, we've got research stations there too. We've built cities that glow from space, created machines that think, sent our technology to the edge of the solar system. We've mapped our own DNA, split the atom, eradicated diseases that killed millions. We are, without question, the most dominant species this planet has ever seen. But here's the thing that should make you pause. It almost didn't happen, not even close. 7 million years ago, there was no hint that one particular group of African apes would eventually rule the world. Nothing special about them, really. They weren't the biggest, weren't the fastest, didn't have the sharpest teeth or the longest claws. If you were betting on which species would eventually build the internet and land robots on Mars, you probably wouldn't have picked our ancestors. You might have gone with the big cats, the powerful elephants, maybe even other apes that seemed better adapted to their environments. And yet, here we are. The question is, how? How did we go from unremarkable primates scrambling through African forests to a species that has fundamentally reshaped the entire planet? What happened during those 7 million years that transformed us into something completely unprecedented in Earth's history? That's the journey we're about to take together. Not rushed, not frantic, just a calm walk through deep time, watching our story unfold generation by generation, million by million years. Every twist, every near disaster, every incredible breakthrough that led to you right now. Read in these words, if you're here to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly what this is for. Let the story wash over you. Let those millions of years blur into a comfortable haze. And hey, do me a favor and drop a comment. Where are you right now? What time is it? I love seeing them. Sao Paulo at sunset, Singapore at sunset, Singapore at sunset, Seattle in the middle of the night. All these different moments, all connected by this one strange journey backward through time. Now, what makes human evolution so different from every other species? Why should you care about a bunch of bones and fossils and ancient extinct relatives you'll never meet? Because unlike any other evolutionary story on Earth, ours is ridiculously unlikely. Most species evolve slowly, adapting to their environment over millions of years, getting better at one specific thing. Cheetahs got faster, giraffes got taller, polar bears got better at surviving the cold. Standard evolution stuff. But humans, we went in a completely different direction. We didn't get bigger or stronger or faster. We didn't grow armor or venom or wings. Instead, we got weird. We stood upright, which is biomechanically inefficient and made childbirth dangerous. We lost most of our body hair, which removed natural protection from the elements. Our brains got absurdly large, which required massive amounts of energy and made our heads so big that human babies have to be born basically premature compared to other mammals. Every one of these changes should have been an evolutionary dead end. Standing upright made us slower runners and easier targets for predators. Losing our fur made us vulnerable to temperature extremes. Big brains meant mothers needed more food and faced life-threatening difficulties during birth. By all logic, our evolutionary paths should have led straight to extinction. But it didn't. Somehow, against all odds, these weird adaptations combined in just the right way to create something unprecedented. A species that could adapt to any environment, not by evolving new bodies, but by changing our behavior. We couldn't survive the cold, naturally, so we invented clothing. And fire. We weren't strong enough to kill large prey, so we invented sophisticated tools and cooperative hunting strategies. Our bodies stayed relatively weak, but our minds became the most powerful survival tool in nature. The story of how this happened is not neat. It's not a straight line from primitive ape to modern human. It's messy, chaotic, full of dead ends and extinct cousins and species that tried different strategies and failed. For every human ancestor that succeeded, there were dozens that vanished forever, leaving nothing but a few fossilized bones buried in African soil. We're going to meet them all, the early primates swinging through ancient forests, the first apes to stand upright, Lucy and her relatives walking on two legs, but still spending time in trees, The first tool makers, the first to control fire, the first to leave Africa and spread across the world. The cousins who nearly made it, the Neanderthals and Denisovans and others, sharing the planet with our direct ancestors until very recently. And through it all, we're going to ask the questions that matter. Not just what happened, but why. What were the pressures that shaped us? What accidents and disasters and lucky breaks led to us being here today? What does our evolutionary history tell us about who we are as a species? So, settle in, get comfortable. Let's go back 7 million years and watch the whole thing unfold. Nice and slow. No rush. The journey begins in Africa, as all human stories do in the hot forests of the Maini epoch. Before we can talk the dawn of primates, our distant ancestors, 7 million years ago, about humans, we need to talk about a rock from space. 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 6 miles across slammed into what is the Yucatan Peninsula with a force of 10 billion atomic bombs. The impact vaporized thousands of cubic miles of rock, sending it into the atmosphere as superheated dust. Within hours, the entire planet was shrouded in darkness. Within days, global temperatures plummeted. Within weeks, photosynthesis had essentially stopped. And within months, roughly 75% of all species on Earth were gone. The dinosaurs, which had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for 165 million years, were finished. Not all at once, not everywhere. But the asteroid had fundamentally broken the world they depended on. The massive herbivores starved when the plants died. The massive carnivores starved when the herbivores disappeared. A few smaller dinosaurs, the ancestors of modern birds, managed to survive. But the age of giant reptiles was over, and in the smoking ruins of their world, something else began to stir. Mammals had existed alongside dinosaurs for over 60 million years, but they'd been relegated to the margins, the ecological leftovers. Most were small, nocturnal, insect-eating creatures that looked more like shrews than anything you'd recognize today. They survived by staying out of the way, by being too insignificant for the ruling reptiles to bother with. The asteroid changed everything. Suddenly, all that empty ecological space, all those niches that had been occupied by dinosaurs for millions of years, they were available. And mammals, tough little survivors that they were, began filling them with explosive speed. Within a million years of the impact, which is nothing in evolutionary terms, mammals are diversified into dozens of new body plans. Some became grazers, replacing the herbivorous dinosaurs. Others became predators, taking over from the carnivorous theropods. Still others took to the water, the air, the underground, and some went into the trees. The earliest primates appear, around 65 million years ago, right in the aftermath of the extinction. They were small creatures, probably weighing less than a pound, with long tails and sharp claws for climbing. They looked more like squirrels than monkeys, more like rats than anything you'd call an ancestor. But they had something special, something that would eventually lead to you reading these words, pondering your own origins. They had forward-facing eyes. Now this might not sound revolutionary, but think about it. Most mammals have eyes on the sides of their heads. Horses, deer, rabbits, they all have wide-set eyes that give them nearly 360 degrees vision. This makes sense if you're prey. You need to see predators coming from any direction. But forward-facing eyes do something else entirely. They sacrifice that peripheral vision for something far more valuable. Depth perception. When both eyes face forward, their fields of vision overlap. Your brain can compare the slightly different images from each eye and calculate precise distances. This is called stereoscopic vision, and it's absolutely essential for one thing in particular: moving through trees. Those early primates were living in a three-dimensional maze of branches, leaves, and gaps. A mistaken judging distance, a miscalculated leap from one branch to another, and you were dead. Natural selection was brutal and immediate. Primates with better depth perception survived. Those without fell. Over millions of years, this pressure refined primate vision to extraordinary precision. We became the best depth-judging mammals on the planet. Even today, Human visual processing devotes an enormous amount of brain power to calculating distances. It's why we're so good at throwing things, at catching objects, at navigating complex spaces. We inherited that from rat-sized tree dwellers who lived in constant fear of falling. But vision wasn't the only innovation. Around 55 million years ago, primates developed something even more revolutionary: opposable thumbs. Actually, let's be precise. They developed opposable digits. Thumbs that could rotate and touch the other fingers. This changed everything. Before opposable thumbs, primates grasped branches with their whole hands, using sharp claws to maintain grip. It worked, but it was clumsy, imprecise. With opposable thumbs, they could grip branches between thumb and fingers, using controlled pressure rather than piercing. This allowed much more precise manipulation of objects. Suddenly, primates could pick individual fruits from branches. They could strip bark to find insects underneath. They could manipulate small objects, examining them from different angles. Their hands became tools capable of extracting resources that other animals couldn't access. The fossil record from this period shows an explosion of primate diversity. By 50 million years ago, dozens of primate species had spread across Africa, Europe, Asia, and even North America, which was warmer and more tropical then. They range from tiny nocturnal insect eaters to larger fruit and leaf specialists. But then geography intervened. Around 40 million years ago, South America separated from Africa as continental. Drift continued reshaping the planet. A population of primates found themselves stranded on the South American continent, isolated from their African cousins by an ever-widening Atlantic Ocean. This created one of the most important splits in primate evolution: the division between New World and Old World primates. The New World primates, isolated in South America, evolved in their own direction. They developed prehensile tails, essentially a fifth limb that could grasp branches. Many remained relatively small and specialized for life in the dense rainforests. Their descendants include modern spider monkey, howler monkeys, and marmosets. But it was the Old World primates, the ones that stayed in Africa and Asia, that would eventually produce humans. And they were about to undergo a transformation that would change life on Earth forever. Around 30 million years ago, the climate began shifting. Global temperatures dropped. Rainforests contracted. More open woodland habitats appeared. And in response to these changing conditions, a new group of primates emerged: the early apes. Now, apes aren't monkeys. Despite what popular usage suggests, apes are distinguished by several key features. They lack tails. They have more flexible shoulder joints that allow them to swing from branches rather than just walking on top of them. Most importantly, they have significantly larger brains relative to their body size. That last point is crucial. The earliest apes, appearing around 25 million years ago, showed brain sizes roughly 50% larger than comparable monkeys. This wasn't just random variation. Larger brains provided real advantages in the increasingly seasonal and variable environments of the late Paleogene. With bigger brains came enhanced memory, allowing apes to remember the locations of scattered food sources across large territories. They could remember which trees fruited when, which areas had water during dry seasons, which routes were safest. This mental mapping ability let them exploit resources more efficiently than their smaller relatives. Bigger brains also enabled more complex social behaviors. Early apes lived in groups of 20 to 50 individuals, and these groups had social hierarchies. Alliances, conflicts, navigating the social landscape required intelligence, the ability to remember who was allied with whom, who owed favors, who had shown aggression. The smartest apes, those who could manipulate social relationships most effectively, gained better access to food, mates, and safety. Natural selection was now favoring intelligence in ways it never had before. And once that process started, it accelerated rapidly. By 20 million years ago, apes had diversified into dozens of species across Africa and Eurasia. Some were small, gibbon-like creatures that specialized in swinging through forest canopies. Others were massive like Giganticus, which could reach 10 feet tall and weigh over 1,000 pounds. Most fell somewhere in between. But then the climate changed again. Starting around 14 million years ago, global temperatures dropped further. Ice began forming at the poles year-round for the first time in millions of years. Ruined forests continued contracting, replaced by woodlands, and increasingly grasslands. This climate shift hit the apes hard. Species adapted to dense forest environments found their habitat shrinking. Many went extinct. By 10 million years ago, ape diversity had collapsed, dozens of species reduced to just a handful. But the survivors, the apes that managed to adapt to these new conditions, they were special. They were larger, more flexible, more capable of adjusting their behavior when environments changed. They were the ones that would eventually give rise to both modern apes and humans. The critical period was between 10 and 7 million years ago. The African continent was undergoing dramatic geological changes. The East African Rift System, a massive tear in the Earth's crust, was opening up. As the land split apart, mountains rose along the Rift Valley. These mountains created a rain shadow effect, blocking moisture from the Indian Ocean. East of the mountains, the climate became drier. Forests gave way to woodland savannas, areas with scattered trees separated by grasslands. This created a fundamentally new environment, something that hadn't existed before in quite this way, and it created new selection pressures. Apes living in these transition zones faced a choice. They could retreat westward, following the forests as they shrank, or they could adapt to the new woodland savanna environment. Most chose retreat. Their descendants became modern chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas, species that remain primarily forest-dwelling. But some stayed, some adapted, and in adapting to life in a more open environment, they began the transformation that would eventually lead to us. These transitional apes, living between 10 and 7 million years ago, faced unique challenges. In dense forests, food was everywhere. Fruits, leaves, insects, they were within arm's reach. But in woodland savannas, resources were more scattered. You might need to travel hundreds of yards between fruit trees. You might need to venture out into open grassland. To reach water sources, this created enormous pressure to become more efficient at covering ground. Quadrupedal knuckle walking, the way modern chimpanzees move on the ground, works fine in forests where you're mostly climbing anyway, but it's inefficient for long-distance travel. You're carrying weight on your arms, which are better suited for climbing than walking. Natural selection began favoring individuals who could walk upright more effectively. Not all the time, not yet. But those who could stand and walk on two legs, when necessary, had advantages. They could cover ground more efficiently. They could see farther across the grassland, spotting both opportunities and threats. They could carry food, tools, or infants while moving. Over hundreds of thousands of years, subtle changes accumulated. Spines became more vertical. Pelvises widened and tilted to better support upright posture. Feet developed arches that worked like springs, making bipedal walking more efficient. The foramen magnum, the hole where the spinal cord enters the skull, migrated from the back of the skull, leveled toward the bottom, allowing the head to balance on top of a vertical spine. These weren't dramatic changes at first. The transitional apes probably still spent significant time in trees, still use quadruple locomotion sometimes. They were hedging their bets, maintaining the old adaptations while developing new ones. But around 7 million years ago, something happened. The fossil record is frustratingly sparse from this period, but genetic evidence tells us when it occurred. The population of transitional apes split. One group continued evolving as forest-adapted quadrupeds. They became the ancestors of modern chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. The other group committed fully to the woodland savanna lifestyle. They became increasingly bipedal, increasingly adapted to life on the ground. Their brains continued growing. Their tool use became more sophisticated. Their social groups became larger and more complex. They crossed the threshold from ape to something new. They became the first hominins, the first members of the human family. We don't have fossils of this last common ancestor. the creature that was simultaneously the last of the pure apes and the first of our lineage. It lived somewhere in East Africa, probably in what is now Ethiopia or Kenya. It was likely chimp-sized, maybe 80 to 100. It probably still climbed trees regularly, but was increasingly comfortable on the ground. And it had no idea that its descendants would one day walk on the moon, split the atom, sequence their own genome. It was just trying to survive in a changing world, just trying to find food, avoid predators, and raise offspring. But the genetic changes were happening. The neural adaptations that would eventually allow abstract reasoning, language, art, science, they were beginning, not as sudden mutations, but as gradual refinements, generation by generation selected for by the demands of an environment that rewarded intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. The asteroid that killed the dinosaurs had set everything in motion. 66 million years earlier, the development of forward-facing eyes and opposable thumbs had given primates the tools they needed. The growing brains of the early apes had provided the cognitive foundation. The climate changes of the late Meson had created the perfect crucible for transformation. And now, 7 million years ago, the stage was set. Africa, the cradle of humanity, held our ancestors. They were no longer quite apes, not yet quite human. They were something in between, something transitional. They were the beginning of our story. The first chapter in a journey that would span millions of years, cross every continent, and eventually reach out to the stars themselves. But first, they had to learn to walk. Let's go way back 7 walking upright. The first hominins, 4 million years ago. Million years ago, Africa looks nothing like the continent we know today. The Sahara Desert doesn't exist yet. Instead, vast tropical forests stretch across regions that are now barren sand. But something is happening. Something that will change the course of life on Earth forever. The climate is shifting, not catastrophically, not all at once, but persistently, relentlessly. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the forests are fragmenting. Open woodlands are appearing where dense jungle once stood. Grasslands are emerging in patches between the trees. And somewhere in this changing landscape, an ape makes a decision that will echo through millions of years of evolution. It stands up. Now, we need to talk about what we actually know, because the fossil record from this period is frustratingly sparse. We're trying to reconstruct millions of years of evolutionary history, from a handful of bones scattered across Africa, preserved by geological accidents. It's like trying to understand a 1,000-page novel when you only have a few random sentences from different chapters. But those sentences are extraordinary. The earliest potential human ancestor we found is called Sahelanthropus chadensis. The nickname is Tumi, which means hope of life in the local language. That's fitting because when paleontologist Michel Brun and his team found this skull in Chad in 2001, it gave us hope that we might finally understand where our lineage began. Tumi lived around 7 million years ago, right around the time that genetic studies suggest the human and chimpanzee lineages diverged. The skull is fascinating, bizarre, really. It has features that seem completely contradictory. The face looks surprisingly human, relatively flat, not protruding like a chimpanzee's. The teeth show characteristics that suggest a shift away from purely ape-like diets, but the brain case is tiny, about the size of a modern chimpanzee's. Most intriguingly, the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull, where the spine connects, is positioned more toward the center than in apes. In quadrupedal animals, animals that walk on 4 legs, this hole is toward the back of the skull. In bipedal animals, animals that walk upright, it's more centrally located, because the spine needs to support the head from directly below. Tumi's foramen magnum suggests it might have walked upright, at least some of the time. But here's the problem. We only have the skull, no leg bones, no pelvis, nothing that could definitively tell us how this creature moved. So the debate continues. Some researchers think Tumi represents the earliest hominin, the first member of our evolutionary family, after the split from chimpanzees. Others think it's just an ancient ape, not directly related to humans at all. This uncertainty isn't frustrating. It's honest. Science doesn't give us neat origin stories. It gives us fragments, clues, questions that lead to more questions. But let's assume for a moment that Toomey was one of our ancestors, or at least closely related to them. Why would natural selection favor walking upright? This is one of the most debated questions in paleoanthropology, and the answers are surprisingly complex. The traditional explanation goes like this. As African forests fragmented into open woodlands and grasslands, early hominins needed to travel longer distances between patches of trees. Walking upright is more energy efficient than knuckle walking when covering open ground. An upright posture also raises the head higher, allowing better visibility over tall grass to spot predators and food sources. Plus, it frees the hands to carry food, tools, and infants. This all sounds reasonable, logical, but recent research suggests reality was probably messier and more interesting. First, bipedalism didn't evolve on the savanna. The earliest hominins weren't grassland creatures. They were still primarily forest and woodland dwellers. Toomey was found in an area that would have been a mosaic environment. Patches of forest, woodland, and grassland all mixed together. So whatever advantages bipedalism provided, they weren't just about adapting to open plains. Second, bipedalism is actually pretty inefficient, at least at first. Modern humans are very good at walking upright because we've had millions of years to perfect it. Our spines have developed curves that act like springs, storing and releasing energy with each step. Our feet have evolved into complex arches that function like levers. Our leg muscles and tendons have adapted to make upright walking nearly effortless. But the first bipedal hominins didn't have any of these refinements. They would have been awkward, slow, burning more energy than their quadrupedal cousins. Natural selection doesn't favor inefficiency unless there's a compensating advantage. So, what was it? One controversial theory suggests bipedalism evolved for thermorelation, temperature control. An upright posture exposes less body surface to the intense midday sun. Stand up and only your head and shoulders are getting blasted with direct sunlight. Walk on all fours and your entire back is exposed. In the increasingly open environments of late Mesoamerica, staying cool would have been a significant survival advantage. Another theory focuses on feeding strategies. Bipedalism allows you to reach higher into trees, accessing fruits and leaves that quadrupedal apes can't reach. It also allows you to feed while standing in shallow water, harvesting aquatic plants and catching fish and shellfish. Some researchers think early hominins might have been semi-aquatic, spending significant time in rivers and wetlands. Then there's the social hypothesis. Some primatologists have noticed that chimpanzees and bonobos often stand upright during displays of aggression, or when carrying food they don't want to share. Walking upright makes you look bigger, more intimidating. It also frees your hands for gesturing, carrying resources, even carrying infants more efficiently. In social animals, anything that improves your ability to compete for mates and resources gets selected for. The truth is probably some combination of all these factors. Evolution doesn't optimize for one thing. It's a constant compromise, balancing multiple selective pressures simultaneously. Early hominins might have started walking upright for cooling, found it useful for reaching food, discovered it helped in social interactions, and gradually refined the ability over millions of years. Around 4.4 million years ago, we get another snapshot of this evolutionary process. Her name is Ari. Ardipithecus rondus was discovered in Ethiopia in the 1990s. But it took researchers 15 years to carefully excavate, analyze, and publish their findings. What they found changed our understanding of human evolution completely. Adi was mosaic, part ape, part hominin, part something entirely unique. She was about 40 tall, weighed maybe 110 pounds. Her brain was still tiny, only slightly larger than a chimpanzee's, but her skeleton tells an extraordinary story. Her pelvis shows adaptations for bipedalism, but not the same adaptations we see in later hominins. The structure suggests she could walk upright, but probably with a different gait than modern humans, more hip-swaying, less efficient. Her feet were bizarre. They had an opposable big toe, like an ape's foot designed for grasping branches, but the rest of the foot showed modifications for supporting body weight during upright walking. This tells us something profound. Adi could both climb trees and walk upright, probably switching between modes depending on circumstances. She wasn't transitioning from life in the trees to life on the ground. She was doing both simultaneously, exploiting resources in multiple environmental zones. Her hands were equally revealing, unlike modern chimpanzees and gorillas, which have hands adapted for knuckle walking with shortened fingers and reinforced wrists. Hard's hands were more flexible, more manipulative. She could still climb, but she wasn't specialized for knuckle walking. This suggests that knuckle walking evolved in chimps and gorillas after they diverged from our common ancestor. Early hominins didn't evolve from knuckle walkers. They evolved from something more generalized, more flexible. Her teeth tell another story. Art's canine teeth were much smaller than those of chimpanzees. In apes, large canines are primarily used by males for aggressive displays and fighting over mates. Smaller canines suggest a shift in social structure, possibly toward reduced male-male aggression and increased cooperation. Think about what this means. 4.5 million years ago, our ancestors were already becoming less aggressive, more social. The foundations of human cooperation were being laid long before big brains, long before language, long before anything we'd recognize as distinctly human. But Artie lived in forests and woodlands, not open grasslands. Her skeleton suggests she spent significant time in trees, probably sleeping in them for safety, possibly feeding on fruits and leaves, high in the canopy. Yet she was also adapted for ground-based bipedalism. Why? The answer is probably in what was happening to the African climate. Between 7 and 4 million years ago, East Africa was experiencing gradual but significant environmental change. Global temperatures were dropping. Ice sheets were expanding in Antarctica. Ocean circulation patterns were shifting. And in Africa, the result was increasing seasonality. Seasons became more pronounced, wet seasons, and dry seasons more extreme. The reliable year-round rainfall that maintained dense forests was becoming less predictable. Forests were contracting, fragmenting, leaving patches of woodland separated by increasingly open terrain. For most apes, this was a crisis. Apes are forest specialists. They need trees for food, shelter, and safety. As forests shrank, ape populations contracted with them. Most ape lineages went extinct or retreated to remaining forest refuse. But some apes, the ones that would become hominins, had accidentally stumbled on an adaptation that allowed them to exploit this changing landscape. They could walk between forest patches. They could forage in both trees and on the ground. They could survive in the mosaic environments that were replacing the continuous forests. This is how evolution works. Not through grand plans, raw purposeful adaptation, but through fortunate accidents that happen to provide advantages when environments change. Bipedalism probably started as a quirky variation, maybe even maladaptive in stable forest environments. But when the forest started fragmenting, it became a survival advantage. The teeth of these early hominins reveal how their diets were changing. Unlike modern apes, which have large, sharp canines and thin tooth enamel designed for eating fruits and soft plant material, early hominins were developing smaller canines and thicker enamel. This suggests a shift toward tougher, more abrasive foods. They were probably eating more seeds, nuts, and hard fruits. More underground storage organs, roots and tubers that could be dug up during dry seasons when other food was scarce. More diverse diets that allowed them to survive in environments where apes would starve. This dietary flexibility is crucial. It's one of the key factors that allowed hominins to survive and eventually thrive as Africa's climate continued to change. While other primates remained specialized, tied to specific foods and habitats, early hominins were becoming generalists, opportunists capable of exploiting whatever resources were available. The sexual dimorphism in early hominins, the size difference between males and females, also tells us something about their social structure. In species with extreme size dimorphism like gorillas, where males can be twice the size of females, you typically see intense male competition and herb-based mating systems. One dominant male monopolizes multiple females, while other males are excluded from reproduction entirely. In species with minimal-sized dimorphism like gibbons, where males and females are similar sizes, you typically see monogamous pair bonding with minimal male competition. Early hominins fall somewhere in between. Males were definitely larger than females, but not as dramatically as in gorillas. This suggests a social system based on multi-male, multi-female groups with moderate competition between males. Not the extreme winner-take-all competition of gorillas, but not the peaceful pair bonding of gibbons either. This social structure would have required new cognitive abilities. In multi-male groups, individuals need to track complex social relationships, form alliances, engage in reciprocal exchanges, remember who helped them and who didn't. This creates selective pressure for increased intelligence, better memory, enhanced social awareness. So, even at this early stage, millions of years before the emergence of large brains, natural selection was favoring individuals who are better at navigating social complexity. The seeds of human intelligence were being planted in the social challenges faced by early bipedal apes trying to survive in fragmenting forests. But here's where things get complicated and, honestly, where the science becomes genuinely uncertain. We don't have a clear, unbroken chain of fossils connecting these early hominins to later humans. We have snapshots from different times and places, and we're trying to figure out how they relate to each other and to us. Are we descended from Sahelanthropus, from Erapithecus, from some other early hominin we haven't discovered yet? The honest answer is we don't know for certain. The fossil record has gaps, big ones. For every hominin species we've discovered, there might be dozens we haven't found yet. Species that lived and died without leaving any fossils we've been able to locate. What we do know is this. Somewhere between 7 and 4 million years ago, in the fragmenting forests of Africa, some apes began walking upright regularly. They developed teeth adapted for tougher, more varied diets. They evolved social structures based on cooperation and reduced aggression, and they began the journey that would eventually lead to us. The climate was pushing them, selecting for flexibility, adaptability, intelligence. Each generation that survived did so because they were slightly better at exploiting new environments, processing new foods, cooperating with group members. The accumulation of these tiny advantages over hundreds of thousands of generations created something genuinely new. Not apes anymore, but not quite human either. Something in between, something still taking shape. The first hominins walking upright into an uncertain future, carrying within them the genetic potential for all that would come after. They couldn't have known they were beginning an evolutionary journey that would take their descendants across every continent into every environment Earth had to offer. They were just trying to survive one generation at a time in a world that was slowly, relentlessly changing around them. But survive they did. And in surviving, they set the stage for the next chapter of human evolution. For the emergence of species that would be even more adaptable, even more successful in the face of environmental change. Species like the Auropithecines, who would take the basic hominin body plan and refine it, perfect it, turn bipedalism from an awkward compromise into an efficient mode of locomotion that could carry them across entire continents. That story is coming. But for now, picture those early hominins standing upright in the dappled sunlight of a fragmenting African forest 5 million years ago. They don't look like much. They're small, awkward, probably confused by their changing world. But they're standing, and that changes everything. Now we arrive at one of the Lucy and her kin, the Australopithecines. 2 million years ago, most famous chapters in human evolution, the Australopithecines, and we meet to talk about Lucy. Oh no! November 24th, 1974, in the Afar region of Ethiopia, paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson was surveying a gully that his team had already searched multiple times. It was late afternoon. The sun was brutal. Everyone was ready to head back to camp. But Johanson decided to check one more ravine just in case. And there, lying on the ground, partially exposed by recent rains, he saw a piece of arm bone, then another bone, then another bone, then another. What he had found would become the most famous fossil in the world. They called her Lucy, after the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds that was playing in camp that night. And she was 3.2 million years old. But here's what makes Lucy so special. She wasn't just fragments. She wasn't just a jaw, a skull cap, or a few teeth like most hominin fossils. Lucy was 40% complete. That might not sound like much, but in paleoanthropology, finding 40% of a skeleton that old is like winning the lottery. Getting struck by lightning and finding a unicorn all on the same day. It just doesn't happen. Lucy's skeleton told a story that changed everything. We thought we knew about human evolution. She was small, about 3½ feet tall. She weighed maybe 60 pounds. Her brain was tiny, about the size of a chimpanzee's, roughly 400 centimeters, compared to our 1400. But here's the thing. She walked upright, not occasionally, not as a sometimes thing. She was a full-time biped. Look at her pelvis. It's short and broad, nothing like the long, narrow pelvis of a chimpanzee. It's shaped to support her internal organs while standing upright, exactly like ours. Look at her knee joint. It angles inward, what anatomists call a VG guess knee. This lets the foot land directly under the body's center of mass with each step. Chimpanzees don't have this. They waddle when they walk on two legs because their knees don't angle inward. Lucy didn't waddle. She strode. Look at her foot bones. The big toe points forward, not out to the side like an ape's grasping toe. She couldn't grab branches with her feet anymore. She had committed fully to a life on the ground. But here's what's wild. Her arms were still relatively long. Her fingers were still curved, features adapted for climbing. So Lucy was caught between two worlds, fully bipedal on the ground, but probably still spending time in trees, maybe sleeping there at night to avoid predators, maybe retreating to the branches when danger approached. She represented a species called Orolopithecus afarenus, the southern ape from the Afar region. And she wasn't alone. Since Lucy's discovery, researchers have found hundreds of other Orolopithecus afarensis fossils, enough to know that this species lived in East Africa from about 3.9 to 2.9 million years ago, enough to understand how they lived, what they ate, how they survived. But before we go further, we need to talk about the footprints. Because in 1976, just 2 years after Lucy's discovery, paleoanthropologist Mary Leakey made a discovery in Tanzania that was somehow even more profound. At a site called Lee, volcanic ash had fallen 3.66 million years ago. Soon after, maybe within hours, 3 individuals walked across this ash. Then another volcanic eruption buried their footprints, preserving them perfectly for nearly 4 million years. When Leakey's team uncovered these footprints, they were looking at something unprecedented. Direct evidence of bipedal walking, not inferred from bone structure, not reconstructed from fossil anatomy. Actual footprints showing the gait, the stride length, the weight distribution of creatures walking upright. 3.66 million years ago, the prints show a deep heel strike, a strong longitudinal arch, a powerful toe off. These are the footprints of committed bipeds. More than that, they show 3 individuals walking together, 2 large, live individuals, probably adults, and 1 smaller one, possibly a child, walking in the same direction, maybe walking together as a family group. It's one of the most emotionally powerful moments in all of paleoanthropology. You can stand there and look at footprints made by your ancestors 3.6 million years ago. You can see exactly where they stepped, how they walked. Imagine them pausing to look at something, continuing on their way across the volcanic plain. The footprints almost certainly belong to Orolopithecus afarenus. The date matches perfectly with Lucy's species. The location is right, and the foot anatomy implied by the prints matches what we see in Lucy's skeleton. So now we had 2 lines of evidence. Fossilized bones showing bipedal anatomy and fossilized footprints showing bipedal behavior. The case was closed. By 3.6 million years ago, our ancestors were walking upright full time. But why? That's the question that keeps researchers up at night. Walking upright is energetically efficient for long distance travel, but it's slower than quadrupedal running for short bursts. It frees up the hands for carrying things. But early homins weren't making complex tools yet. It raises the head higher to spot predators, but it also makes you more visible to those same predators. The truth is, we still don't fully understand why bipedalism evolved. It probably wasn't one single advantage, but a combination of factors. Energy efficiency for traveling between scattered food sources, ability to carry food, infants, or other resources. Reduce sun exposure on the African savanna by presenting less surface area to the midday sun. Maybe even social signaling. Standing upright makes you look bigger, more impressive. In a social species that might matter for attracting mates or intimidating rivals, whatever the reason, bipedalism had become the defining feature of the sec. Hominin lineage and Lucy's species, Oralopithecus afarenus, had fully committed to it, but they weren't the only Oralopithecines. Not by a long shot. Africa, between 4 and 2 million years ago, was filled with different species, different experiments in the Oralopithecine body plan. And they were competing, coexisting, sometimes living in the same regions at the same times. Let's go back a bit. In 1924, decades before Lucy's discovery, anatomist Raymond Dart was examining fossils sent to him from a limestone quarry in South Africa. Among them was a small skull, clearly juvenile, with an unusual mix of ape-like and human-like features. Dart called it Oralopithecus africanus, the southern ape from Africa. Specifically, it became known as the town child, named after the location where it was found. The town child was younger than Lucy, dating to about 2.88 million years ago, and it showed something fascinating. While Oralopithecus afarensis lived in East Africa, a different species of Oralopithecine was living way down in South Africa at the same time. They were similar in many ways. Small body size, small brain, bipedal locomotion. But there were differences too. Oralopithecus africanus had a slightly more rounded skull, slightly smaller teeth, slight differences in limb proportions. These weren't huge differences. If you saw both species from a distance, you might not be able to tell them apart, but they were enough to show that the Oralopithecines weren't one uniform group. They were diversifying, adapting to different regional conditions, splitting into multiple species across the African continent. And then things got really interesting. Starting around 2.5 million years ago, a new group of Oralopithecines appeared. We call them the robust Australe. Robust is exactly the right word. These creatures had massive jaws, enormous molars, thick enamel on their teeth, heavy brow ridges. Some species even had sagittal crests, bony ridges running along the top of the skull where massive chewing muscles attached. They looked like the bodybuilders of the hominin world. But here's the thing, they weren't eating meat. All that massive jaw architecture was for processing tough plant materials, roots, tubers, seeds, hard fruits. The kind of foods that require serious grinding power to break down. The most famous robust Australopithecine is Pranthropus bois, sometimes called Nutcracker Man, because of its massive nose. This species lived in East Africa from about 2.3 to 1.22 million years ago. Its teeth show distinctive wear patterns consistent with eating hard, gritty foods. Chemical analysis of the teeth confirms a diet heavy in tough vegetation. Another robust species, Paranthropus robustus, lived in South Africa roughly the same time. Similar adaptations, massive jaws, huge chewing muscles specialized for processing low-quality vegetation that other species couldn't efficiently exploit. So now we had two groups of Oralopithecines coexisting. The gracile Oralopithecines like Lucy's species with more generalized diets and anatomy, and the robust Oralopithecines, specialized for tough plant foods with jaws built like industrial grinders. They weren't directly competing. They were eating different foods, exploiting different ecological niches. When you put multiple species in the same environment, natural selection tends to push them toward different specializations. It reduces competition. It allows coexistence. That's exactly what was happening across Africa between 3 and 2 million years ago. But there was also something else happening. Something that would prove far more important than jaw size or tooth shape. Some of these Australopithecines were starting to use tools. Now, this is controversial. The evidence is complicated, and we, Need to be careful about what we mean by tool use. Lots of animals use tools. Chimpanzees use sticks to fish for termites. Crows use hooks to extract insects from tree bark. Sea otters use rocks to crack open shellfish. Tool use isn't uniquely human, but making tools, deliberately modifying objects to create specific functions, that's much rarer. And somewhere around 3.3 million years ago, something in Africa started doing exactly that. In 2015, researchers working in Kenya found stone tools dating to 3.3 million years ago. These weren't sophisticated tools. They were simple flakes and cores, rocks that had been deliberately struck to create sharp edges, but they were definitely made. The striking patterns are clear. These weren't naturally broken rocks. Something had deliberately manufactured them. But who made them? Here's the problem. The only hominin species we know of living in that region at that time was Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy's species. But can we be sure they were the tool makers? We don't have direct evidence. No Australopithecine skeleton found holding a tool. We just have tools and fossils from roughly the same time and place. Some researchers think australians must have made these early tools. They had the hands for it. Their fingers were still curved for climbing, but their thumbs were more robust than those of apes, better suited for precision gripping. They had the brains for it, maybe. At 400 to 500 centimeters, Australopithecine brains were still small, but they were slightly larger than chimpanzee brains relative to body size. And modern chimps can be taught to make simple stone tools. Maybe Australopithecines figured it out on their own. Other researchers are skeptical. They point out that just because we haven't found fossils of other hominins from that period, doesn't mean they didn't exist. The fossil record is incredibly incomplete. Maybe some others still. Undiscovered species was making those early tools. We simply don't know yet. But here's what we do know. By 2.6 million years ago, stone tools become more common in the archaeological record. And shortly after that, around 2.5 million years ago, a new genus appears. Homo, the first humans. Were the Australopithecines making tools? And those tools drove the evolution of early Homo. Or did early Homo appear first, and they were the real tool makers? It's a chicken and egg problem that we still haven't fully solved. What's clear is that the period between 3 and 2 million years ago was transitional. Multiple hominin species were coexisting. Some were specializing in tough plant foods, developing massive jaws and grinding teeth. Others were maintaining more generalized diets, staying flexible, keeping their options open. And in that second group, something was changing. Brains were starting to get bigger, not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years. Some Australopithecine lineages were showing slight increases in brain size. By 2.5 million years ago, some specimens show cranial capacities around 500 to 550 centimeters. Still small by modern standards, but noticeably larger than earlier Australopithecines. This brain expansion came at a cost. Bigger brains require more energy. The human brain today uses about 20% of our total energy budget, despite being only 2% of our body weight. Even small increases in brain size mean higher metabolic demands. So why would natural selection favor bigger brains? The answer probably has to do with food quality and social complexity. If you're eating mostly low-quality vegetation like the robust Australopithecines, you don't have extra energy for a bigger brain. You're locked into your specialization. But if you're eating a more varied, higher-quality diet, if you're maybe starting to include more meat, more fat, more night-dense foods, suddenly you have surplus energy. And if you're living in complex social groups, where you need to track relationships, remember who's allied with whom, engage in cooperative hunting or foraging, a bigger brain becomes advantageous. It lets you navigate social complexity. It lets you learn new skills. It lets you plan ahead, remember where food sources are located, coordinate activities with other group members. Around 2.5 million years ago, something tipped the balance. Some Australopithecine populations found themselves in environments where the benefits of bigger brains outweighed the costs. Maybe it was climate change opening up new food sources. Maybe it was increased competition, driving innovation. Maybe it was social dynamics, rewarding cleverness and cooperation. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. one lineage of Australopithecines began evolving in a new direction. Slightly bigger brains, slightly more gracile bodies, hands better adapted for tool use, faces becoming flatter, less prognathic. They were transitioning, becoming something new, becoming Homo. But the Australopithecines didn't disappear immediately. The robust species, Panthropus bois and Prananthropus robustus, continued successfully for another 1,000,000 years. They'd found a viable ecological niche, and they exploited it well. For a long time, multiple hominin species shared Africa. Early Homo living alongside robust Australopithecines. Different diets, different adaptations, different evolutionary paths. Both successful in their own ways, but eventually the robust Australopithecines went extinct. The last Paranthropus bois fossils date to about 1.2 million years ago. After that, they vanish from the fossil record. Why? We don't know for certain. Maybe climate change reduced the availability of their specialized foods. Maybe early Homo outcompeted them for resources. Maybe it was just bad luck. Small populations in changing environments. One bad drought, one volcanic eruption, one disease outbreak, and they were gone. What we do know is that by 1,000,000 years ago, the Australopithecines were finished. Their 3,000,000-year run was over, but they'd left behind something profound. Descendants who had taken the basic Australopithecine body plan, upright walking, hands freed from locomotion, life in African woodlands, and savus, and pushed it in a new direction. Bigger brains, better tools, more complex social organization. The stage was set for the next chapter, the first true humans, the genus Homo. But before we move on, take a moment to appreciate what the Australopithecines accomplished. For 3,000,000 years, these small-reined upright walking apes survived in Africa. They weren't technological wizards. They weren't building fires or creating art. But they were successful. They diversified into multiple species. They adapted to different environments. They figured out how to make bipedalism work in a world filled with predators, faster and stronger than they were. Lucy and her kin weren't human yet, but they were on the path. They'd solved the first great challenge of human evolution, how to walk upright and survive. Everything that came after, all of human achievement, all of our technology and culture and civilization, it all rests on the foundation built by these small, upright walking apes who lived and died in Africa millions of years before cities or farming or writing or any of the things we think of as defining humanity. They were our ancestors, and without them, none of us would be here. Now we come to the moment when everything changed, when our ancestors stopped the first humans, Homo habilis and early Homo 2.5, Mrs. Early Homo 2.5, 1.5 million years ago, being just another clever ape, and became something fundamentally different, something we would recognize, if on, why barely as human. 2.5 million years ago, in the grasslands and woodlands of East Africa, one of Lucy's descendants picked up a rock and did something revolutionary. They didn't just use it as a tool. Chimpanzees do that. They didn't just throw it or pound something with it. Lots of animals do that. Instead, they took another rock and deliberately struck it at just the right angle, with just the right force to create a sharp edge. They made a tool on purpose, with forethought, with understanding. This might not sound like much. It's just hitting rocks together, right? But think about what it actually requires. You need to understand that certain types of stone fracture in predictable ways. You need to visualize the tool you want to create before it exists. You need the fine motor control to strike with precision. You need to remember the technique and practice it until you get it right. Most importantly, you need to understand cause and effect in a way that goes beyond immediate stimulus and response. You need to think abstractly about future needs and how to meet them. That single moment, that first intentional strike that produced a cutting edge, marks the beginning of technology, the beginning of humanity as a species that doesn't just adapt to its environment through biological evolution, but actively reshapes that environment through cultural innovation. The archaeological term for this ancestor is Homo habilis, handyman. The name is almost absurdly simple for a species that fundamentally altered the trajectory of life on Earth, but it fits. These were the first humans whose defining characteristic was their ability to manipulate their world with their hands and their minds. Now, here's where things get interesting. We don't actually know what Homo habilis looked like in life. We have fragments, pieces of skull and jaw, some hand bones, bits of legs and arms scatter, and across sites in Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia. The most complete specimen is still less than half a skeleton. So when scientists talk about Homo habilis, they're making educated guesses based on fragments, filling in massive gaps with inferences from anatomy and context. What we do know is this: Homo habilis was small, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, weighing perhaps 70 to 100 pounds. Still tree climbers, still built like their Orelopathy ancestors in many ways. But their brains were bigger, significantly so. Averaging about 600 to 750 centimeters compared to the 400 to 500 of the Australopithecines. That's a 50% increase in brain size in evolutionary terms. That happened remarkably quickly, but brain size alone doesn't tell the whole story. The shape of the brain matters too, and Homo habilis skulls show expansion in the areas associated with fine motor control and sequential planning. The parts of the brain that let you think I need to do this, then this, then this, to achieve that result. Tulum regions, problem-solving regions, the neurological hardware for technology. Their hands were changing too, more human-like proportions with shorter fingers and a more opposable thumb. Better leverage, more precise grip. Hands designed not just for climbing and grasping branches, but for manipulating objects with precision, for striking one rock against another at exactly the right angle, for holding a sharp stone flake and cutting through tough animal hide. These changes didn't happen in isolation. They were part of a complete reimagining of what it meant to be a primate. And it all centered around those stone tools. The Oldowan tool industry, that's what archaeologists call the earliest stone tool technology, named after Oldie Gorge in Tanzania, where some of the first examples were discovered. And calling it an industry might seem like an overstatement. These are just broken rocks after all. But that's exactly what they are, an industry. Systematic production of standardized goods, using learned techniques passed down through generations. The basic older toolkit consisted of a few simple types: choppers, cores with a sharp edge, created by removing flakes from one side. Flakes, the sharp pieces removed in the process of making choppers, which are often sharper than the cores themselves. Hammer stones, the rocks used to strike the cores. Sounds primitive, and it is. But these tools opened up entirely new food sources. With a sharp stone flake, you could butcher an animal carcass much more efficiently than with just your teeth and fingernails. You could cut through thick hide that would be impossible to tear with your hands. You could break open long bones to access the nutrient-rich marrow inside. You could process tough plant materials that would otherwise be inedible. Suddenly, your ancestors weren't limited to the foods they could physically consume with their bodies alone. They could access calories that had been locked away behind barriers of hide and bone and fiber. This was huge. This was revolutionary, because calories are everything in evolution. More calories means more energy for growing bigger brains, more energy for longer childhoods, where young could learn complex skills, more energy for longer lifespans, where older individuals could accumulate and pass on knowledge. The feedback loop between tool use and brain development had begun, and it would accelerate for the next 2 million years. The evidence for what these early humans were eating comes from multiple sources. Cut marks on animal bones found at archaeological sites, showing where stone tools sliced through flesh. Broken bones systematically smashed open for marrow. Concentrations of stone tools found alongside butchered animal remains. The picture is clear. Homo habilis was eating meat, lots of it. But here's the thing. They probably weren't hunting, not primarily. Their bodies weren't built for it. They didn't have the long legs for endurance running. They didn't have the throwing power for spear hunting. They didn't have the size and strength for confronting large, dangerous animals. What they were doing was scavenging, and they were apparently very good at it. Imagine this scene. The African savanna 2.3 million years ago. A pride of lions has made a kill, a zebra or antelope. They eat their fill, and then as the day grows hot, they move off to find shade, leaving the carcass behind. But there's still meat on those bones, still marrow inside. Resources that the lions can't effectively access with their teeth alone. Your ancestor has been watching from a distance, not close enough to frighten the lions, but close enough to see when they leave. As soon as the coast is clear, a small group moves in quickly. They're nervous, constantly scanning for danger. Hyenas might show up. The lions might return. Every second counts. They work fast. Stone tools appear from the simple bags they carry. Sharp flakes sliced through the tough hide. The lions couldn't easily penetrate. They cut away chunks of meat, the best pieces, the parts richest in fat and calories. Someone else is smashing long bones with a hammerstone, extracting the marrow. Another is keeping watch, ready to alert the group if danger approaches. 15 minutes, maybe less. They gather what they can carry and retreat to a safer location. Maybe a rocky outcrop where they can see predators coming. Maybe a grove of trees they can climb if necessary. There, they'll finish processing the food, eating some immediately. Maybe carrying some back to share with others who couldn't come on the scavenging expedition. This is called power scavenging. You're not waiting for predators to completely finish with a carcass. You're moving in quickly after the initial kill, using your tools to access resources faster than other scavengers, then getting out before something bigger and more dangerous shows up. It's risky, but the payoff in calories is enormous, and it required intelligence. You needed to track predator movements, predict their behavior, understand their daily patterns. You needed to work in coordinated groups, with some individuals processing the carcass while others kept watch. You needed to make tools ahead of time, prepared for opportunities that might arise. You needed to know which stones made the best tools and where to find them. You needed to teach these skills to your offspring. This lifestyle, this dependence on tools and meat and complex planning, was changing human anatomy in fundamental ways. Those big grinding teeth the Oralapithizens had, Homo habilis didn't need them anymore. Tools could process food externally, doing some of the work that teeth used to do. Over hundreds of thousands of years, jaws became smaller, teeth became reduced. The face became flatter, more human. But while some things got smaller, other things got bigger. Brains were growing, but that created problems. Big brains are expensive. Big brains are expensive. A human brain, even a relatively small one, consumes about 20% of the body's total energy at rest. For most animals, the brain uses maybe 8 to 10%. That's a huge metabolic cost, and evolution doesn't pay those costs without significant benefits. The payoff had to be worth it, and with Homo habilis, it was. Bigger brains meant better tools, which meant more calories from meat, which could support even bigger brains. But it also meant something else, something that would prove even more important in the long run. Childhood was getting longer. You can see it in the growth patterns preserved in fossil teeth, in the proportions of juvenile versus adult skulls. Homo habilis children were taking longer to mature than Eopithecine children had. This might seem like a disadvantage. Longer childhood means more years of dependency, more resources invested in offspring before they can reproduce themselves. But longer childhood also means more time to learn, more years to master the complex skills of tool-making, tracking, scavenging, social coordination. Young Oralapithecines probably learned mainly through instinct and simple imitation. Young Homo habilis could receive active teaching, guided practice, accumulated cultural knowledge passed down through generations. This was the beginning of what anthropologists call extended childhood, one of the defining features of humanity. We're the species that stays young and dependent longer than any other primate, because we have so much to learn that can't be encoded in genes. It has to be taught, practiced, refined, and that process was just beginning 2.5 million years ago. Now the story gets complicated here because Homo habilis wasn't the only game in town. Around the same time, maybe a bit earlier, maybe a bit later, the fossil record shows us another early human, Homo rudolphus. Bigger than Homo habilis with a larger brain, more human-like face, but also some primitive features that don't quite fit the pattern. Scientists have been arguing about Homo rudolphus for decades. Is it a separate species? Is it just a large version of Homo habilis? Is it actually an advanced Orapithecine that doesn't belong in the genus Homo at all? The fossils are fragmentary enough that you can make arguments in multiple directions depending on which features you emphasize. Here's what we know for sure. Between 2.5 and 1.5 million years ago, East Africa was home to multiple types of early humans. They overlapped in time and space. Some made tools, or at least we find tools associated with their fossils. Their brains were bigger than their ancestors. Their teeth and jaws were smaller. They were eating more meat, and they were successful enough to persist for hundreds of thousands of years. Whether we call them one species or two or three is almost beside the point. The real story is that human evolution was experimenting, trying out different combinations of features, different survival strategies. Some of these experiments would lead to dead ends. Others would lead to the lineage that eventually became us. And all of this was happening against a backdrop of dramatic climate instability. This is crucial to understand, because climate change was the engine driving human evolution. On 3 and 1 million years ago, the Earth was transitioning into a period of intense glacial cycling, ice ages becoming more severe, more prolonged, more unpredictable. In Africa, this meant oscillations between wet and dry conditions, grasslands expanding and contracting, forests shrinking and growing. For animals that were narrowly specialized to one environment, this was catastrophic. Populations would expand during favorable periods and crash during unfavorable ones. But for generalists, for species that could adapt behaviorally to changing conditions, this created opportunities. Homo habilis and its relatives were ultimate generalists. They could eat meat or plants depending on availability. They could live in open grasslands or woodlands. They could use tools to access resources that other species couldn't reach. When the climate shifted, they didn't go extinct. They innovated, they adapted, they survived, and natural selection during these unstable periods was intense. Groups that couldn't keep up with environmental changes disappeared. Groups that could innovate, that could develop new tools or new strategies or new social arrangements, they thrived and reproduced over hundreds of thousands of years. This constant pressure sculpted human intelligence, made our brains more flexible, more creative, more capable of finding solutions to novel problems. Think about what this means. For 1 million years, your ancestors lived through cycles of environmental catastrophe and recovery. Droughts that lasted generations, wet periods where resources were abundant, rapid shifts between forest and grassland, each change eliminating some populations and rewarding others. The survivors, the ones whose genes made it through to the other side. They were the flexible ones, the innovative ones, the ones who could look at a problem and figure out a solution, rather than simply repeating instinctive behaviors. By about 1.8 million years ago, something new was emerging from this crucible of selection. A human species that was taller, more long-legged, with an even larger brain. A species that wouldn't just scavenge meat, but could hunt it systematically. A species that wouldn't just survive climate change, but could expand across continents because of the adaptability it had developed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That's the next chapter of the story. For now, understand this. Homo habilis and the other early humans of this period, they were the bridge, the transition from clever apes to something fundamentally new. They were the first to make tools systematically, the first to rely on meat as a major food source, the first to extend childhood for learning, the first to develop the behavioral flexibility that would eventually let humans dominate the planet. They weren't us, not yet. They were still small, still vulnerable, still limited in their capabilities. But they had crossed a threshold that no other species had crossed before. They had learned to reshape their world with their minds and their hands, rather than just adapting to it with their bodies. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no going back. Evolution had found a new strategy, and it was going to run with it as far as it could go. The age of technology had begun. The age of cultural evolution accelerating faster than biological evolution. The age of humans as a species defined not by our physical adaptations, but by our mental ones, by our ability to innovate, learn, and pass knowledge across generations. Everything that would come after all the achievements and catastrophes of human history trace back to those first stone tools made by small-bodied, large-brained ancestors 2.5 million years ago. They didn't know they were starting something revolutionary. They were just trying to survive, trying to get enough calories to feed themselves and their children, trying to make it through another day in a dangerous and unpredictable world. But in doing so, in picking up those rocks and learning to shape them, they set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to cities and civilizations, agriculture and writing, art and science and everything else we associate with being human. All of it starts here with broken rocks and scavenged meat and slightly bigger brains, with extended childhoods and taught skills and cultural knowledge, with the first tentative steps toward becoming something more than just another African ape. The journey was just beginning, and it was going to be remarkable. Around 1.9 million years ago, something spreading across continents, Homo erectus, 1.9 million, 140,000 years ago, remarkable happened. A new kind of human appeared on the African landscape, taller, stronger, more adaptable than anything that had come before. They called themselves Nothing. Of course, names wouldn't come for another 1.5 million years, but we called them Homo erectus, upright man, and they were about to do something no hominin had ever done before. They were going to leave Africa. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's talk about what made erectus so special. Because they weren't just another species of early human. They were a revolution. In 1984, a team of researchers working along the western shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya made one of the most important fossil discoveries in human history. They found the nearly complete skeleton of a young male erectus who died about 1.5 million years ago. He was maybe 8 or 9 years old when he died, and he changed everything we thought we knew about human evolution. They called him Turana Boy, and when they laid out his bones, the researchers couldn't believe what they were seeing. He was tall. If he'd survived to adulthood, he would have stood around 6 feet, maybe taller. His limbs were long and graceful, perfectly proportioned for efficient walking and running. His pelvis was narrow, his rib cage was barrel-shaped. Take away the skull, and you could almost mistake his skeleton for a modern human athlete. This wasn't some hunched ape-like creature. This was a body built for endurance, built for covering vast distances across open savanna, built for a life spent walking. The skull told a different story. Still relatively small by modern standards, about 880 centimeters. But compared to the Australopithecines who came before with their 400 brains, erectus was a genius. Their brains weren't just bigger, they were reorganized. The frontal lobes, the regions associated with planning, problem-solving, and social reasoning had expanded significantly. But here's what really matters about Taka Boy. His body proportions tell us that erectus had fully committed to terrestrial life. They weren't climbing trees anymore, not regularly. They were adapted for one thing, walking incredible distances, across open ground, and walk they did. Within a few hundred years of their appearance in East Africa, erectus populations had spread across the entire continent. South to the Cape, north to the Mediterranean, west into what's now the Sahara, which back then was grassland and woodland. They were everywhere, but Africa wasn't enough. Around 1.8 million years ago, some groups of erectus did something unprecedented in human history. They walked out of Africa, not in one great migration, but in waves over hundreds of thousands of years. Small bands following game herds, tracking seasonal resources, gradually pushing into new territories. They went northeast through the Levant, east across Arabia, eventually reaching as far as Java in Indonesia and northern China. These weren't planned expeditions. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to discover Asia. They were just following food generation after generation, each group pushing a little farther than their parents had gone. In 1891, a Dutch physician named Eugen Dubois found fossils in Java that he called Pithecanthropus erectus, Java man. Local villagers had been finding bones for years, but Dubois was the first to recognize what they were. An ancient human nearly 1 million years old living on an island thousands of miles from Africa. In the 1920s and 30s, excavations at Jukian Cave near Beijing uncovered fossils of Peking man, another erectus population. This one living in northern China around 750,000 years ago. The cave contained layer after layer of occupation debris, stone tools, animal bones, and something else. Something that would change our understanding of human evolution forever. Ash. Lots of it. Carefully controlled fire sites that had been used repeatedly over thousands of years. Fire. Of all the innovations in human history, few compared to the mastery of fire. And Erectus figured it out. Now, we need to be clear about what this means. Early Erectus probably didn't create fire from scratch. That came later. What they learned to do was capture fire from natural sources, lightning strikes and wildfires, and keep it alive, transport it, control it. This might sound simple, but think about what it requires. You need to understand that fire needs fuel. You need to know what burns well and what doesn't. You need to figure out how to maintain the right balance of fuel and oxygen. Too much fuel and you smother it. Too little and it dies. You need to protect it from rain and wind. You need to transport it safely when you move camp. This requires planning, coordination, the ability to teach complex skills to the next generation. Fire doesn't stay lit by itself. Every generation had to learn the skills necessary to capture and maintain it. And once they had fire, everything changed. Fire meant warmth. Erectus could survive cold nights without needing thick fur. They could expand into temperate regions that would have been uninhabitable for their ancestors. They could live in caves deep enough to protect from predators, but previously too cold and dark to be useful. Fire meant protection. No predator, not even the massive saber-toothed cats and giant hyenas that roamed the Pleian world, would willingly approach a controlled fire. For the first time in millions of years of primate evolution, humans didn't have to sleep in trees or worry constantly about nighttime predation. Fire meant better food. Cooking breaks down tough plant fibers and denatures proteins, making nutrients more accessible. A piece of cooked meat provides far more calories than raw meat, because your digestive system doesn't have to work as hard. Cooking effectively outsources part of digestion to the fire. Some researchers think cooking was the key innovation that allowed Erectus brains to grow so large. Brains are metabolically expensive. They consume about 20% of your body's energy, despite making up only 2% of your mass. Without the caloric boost from cooked food, Erectus might not have been able to support their larger brains. But fire did something else, something harder to measure, but perhaps even more important. It created social space. Picture an Erectus camp at dusk. The sun is setting. The dangerous predators are starting to move, but you're not afraid. You're sitting around a fire with your family group. The flames push back the darkness. You're warm, safe, and for a few hours, you have nothing to do but sit together. This is where stories get told, where knowledge gets shared, where social bonds form and strengthen. The firelight extends the social day beyond sunset. It creates time for teaching, for planning, for strengthening the relationships that hold the group together. Some anthropologists think language might have evolved around these ancient campfires, that the need to share increasingly complex information about tool-making, fire management, and resource locations created pressure for better communication. That the quiet evening hours around the fire provided the perfect environment for language to develop and spread, we'll never know for certain. Language doesn't fossilize, but the timing is suggestive. What we do know is that Erectus technology was impressive. They developed what archaeologists call hand axes. These aren't axes in the modern sense. They're teardrop-shaped stone tools, usually about the size of your hand, carefully flaked on both sides to create a sharp edge all the way around. Here's what's remarkable about a hand axes. They first appear in the archaeological record about 1.76 million years ago, and they continue, basically unchanged, for over 1.5 million years. Think about that. The same basic tool design, reproduced across 3 continents for longer than our entire species, has existed. Modern humans have only been around for 300,000 years. Erectus was making the same style of hand axe for 5 times longer than that. Was this technological stagnation? Were Erectus just not smart enough to innovate? Actually, no. It's evidence of something else entirely. Perfection. Chilean hand axes are incredibly versatile tools. You can use them for butchering animals, processing plants, digging for tubers, cutting wood, scraping hides. They're the Swiss Army knife of the Paleolithic. And once Erectus figured out the optimal design, there was no reason to change it. But more importantly, the consistency of Olan hand axes across time and space tells us that Erectus had developed sophisticated cultural transmission. These tools required skill to make. You couldn't just pick up rocks and start flaking. You needed to select the right stone, understand how it would fracture, know the correct angle and force for each strike. This was knowledge that had to be taught and learned generation after generation. For over 1 million years, Erectus parents and grandparents were teaching their children and grandchildren how to make these tools. The tools themselves are fossils of cultural learning, evidence of teaching and social cooperation stretching back almost 2 million years. As time went on, Erectus brains continued to grow. Early Erectus had brains around 80,90,000. But later populations living between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago had brains reaching 100 cc or more. That's approaching the lower end of the modern human range. With bigger brains came more sophisticated behavior. The archaeological record from later Erectus sites shows evidence of systematic hunting, not just scavenging. They were taking down large game, probably using coordinated group tactics. They were selecting specific types of stone for different tools, sometimes traveling dozens of miles to quarry high-quality materials. Most remarkably, there's evidence they were taking care of each other. At Demonian, Georgia, archaeologists found the skull of an elderly Erectus individual who had lost all but one of their teeth years before death. Without teeth, this individual couldn't process raw food. They would have starved within weeks, but they didn't starve. They lived for years after losing their teeth. Someone was feeding them, probably pre-chewing food or preparing it so soft that it didn't require chewing. This individual was being cared for by their group, even though they couldn't contribute much to survival anymore. This is compassion, empathy, the recognition that members of your group have value beyond their immediate utility. Other Erectus sites show similar evidence. Individuals with severe injuries that healed over years. People who survived broken bones, infected wounds, even partially healed skull fractures. These weren't people who could fend for themselves during recovery. They were being protected, fed, and cared for by their communities. This tells us something profound about Erectus social organization. They weren't just cooperating for hunting and gathering. They were forming emotional bonds. They were creating communities where individuals mattered beyond their contribution to group survival. They were becoming human in the way we understand humanity, not just biologically, but socially and emotionally. For over 1.5 million years, Erectus populations thrived across Africa, Europe, and Asia. They survived ice ages and warming periods. They adapted to tropical forests and temperate grasslands. They figured out how to live in environments ranging from the equator to the edge of the Arctic Circle. They were the most successful human species in history. No other hominin lasted as long or spread as far. Modern humans have only been around for 300,000 years. Neanderthals lasted maybe 400,000. Erectus endured for nearly 2 million years, but their story was also one of gradual transformation, because Erectus didn't just go extinct and get replaced by something else. In many places, they evolved into something else. In Africa, Erectus populations were gradually evolving larger brains, more grail body structures, changes in skull shape. By about 600,000 years ago, these populations were transitioning into something new, what anthropologists call archaic Homo sapiens, or Homo heidelbergensis, depending on who you ask. In Europe, Erectus-descended populations were adapting to Ice Age conditions, developing the robust builds and cold weather adaptations that would eventually produce Neanderthals. In Asia, Erectus populations persisted longer, some surviving until less than 140,000 years ago, maybe even later. There are controversial dates from Java suggesting Erectus might have survived until 100,000 years ago or less, possibly overlapping with modern humans. Imagine that. The species that first appeared 1.9 million years ago, still around when anatomically modern humans were already walking the earth. That's staying power. But eventually they were gone. Not wiped out in some dramatic extinction event. They didn't lose a war or succumb to a plague. They evolved. They changed. They became us, or our cousins. Or they faded away as the world filled up with newer, slightly more advanced human species. Still, their legacy remained. Every human species that came after Erectus inherited something from them. The ability to control fire, the knowledge of tool-making, the social structures that allowed caring for the vulnerable, the restless wandering spirit that had carried them out of Africa and across 3 continents. When your ancestors finally left Africa 60,000 years ago, they were walking paths that Erectus had pioneered over 1 million years earlier. When they learned to control fire, they were using techniques developed by Erectus communities 1 million years in the past. When they cared for their elderly and sick, they were continuing traditions that stretched back almost 2 million years. Erectus was the foundation. Everything that came after was built on what they learned, what they discovered, what they figured out through nearly 2 million years of trial, error, and gradual improvement. They were the first true world travelers, the first global humans. And every step you take, every fire you light, every tool you use carries the echo of their achievements. But the story was far from over, because while Erectus populations were evolving and spreading and changing, something new was happening in Europe and Africa. Something that would eventually produce 2 of the most fascinating human species in our history. The Neanderthals were coming, and so were we, around 600,000 years ago. Something Neanderthals and other human cousins. 600,000. Something Neanderthals and other human cousins. 40,000. Remarkable was happening to human evolution. The world was filled with ice. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in cycles, massive glaciers would advance and retreat across the northern continents, transforming landscapes, reshaping coastlines, creating and destroying entire ecosystems. And in the middle of this climate chaos, human populations were diverging, splitting, evolving into distinct species that would become our closest relatives, our cousins, our competitors, our partners. The common ancestor of this diverse family was a species called Homo heidelbergensis. They first appeared around 700,000 years ago, maybe earlier, emerging from earlier Homo populations that had been spread across Africa, Europe, and Western Asia. These weren't your primitive knuckle-dragging cavemen. Homo heidelbergensis stood as tall as modern humans, had brains nearly as large as ours, and showed evidence of sophisticated behavior that would have impressed anyone from just a generation ago. They were master hunters. Archaeological sites show they were taking down large game, elephants, rhinoceroses, deer, using coordinated group tactics that required planning, communication, and trust. They had mastered fire completely, not just opportunistically using natural fires like earlier humans, but deliberately creating fire, controlling it, using it for cooking, warmth, protection, and probably social gatherings. There's evidence they built shelters constructed from wood and possibly animal hides, creating semi-permanent camps in favorable locations. But most importantly, they were adaptable. Homo heidelbergensis populations lived in tropical Africa, temperate Mediterranean zones, and the increasingly cold environments of northern Europe. This geographic spread created the perfect conditions for evolutionary divergence. Different environments, different selection pressures. Different environments, different selection pressures. Different environments, different selection pressures. The populations in Europe were facing challenges that their African relatives couldn't imagine. Ice Age Europe wasn't just cold. It was a climate nightmare. Winters lasted most of the year. Summers were brief, unpredictable. The landscape alternated between frozen tundra and cold grasslands, depending on whether you were in a glacial or interglacial period. Resources were patchy, seasonal, and often scarce. Surviving here required not just intelligence, but physical adaptations to extreme cold. Over hundreds of thousands of years, The European descendants of Homo heidelbergensis began changing. Their bodies became more robust, bones thicker and denser to support massive musculature. Their faces developed prominent brow ridges and receding foreheads. Their nasal passages enlarged dramatically, creating the distinctive protruding nose that would help warm freezing air before it reached their lungs. Their brains actually grew larger than those of modern humans, averaging about 1,600 centimeters compared to our 1,400. By around 400,000 years ago, they had become distinct enough to deserve their own name, Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthalensis. For the next 360,000 years, Neanderthals would dominate Ice Age Europe and parts of Western Asia. They weren't just surviving in this frozen world, they were thriving. And we know this because they left behind a treasure trove of archaeological evidence that reveals just how sophisticated they really were.
Start with their tools.
Neanderthals developed what archaeologists call Mysterian technology, a method of stone old production that shows remarkable planning and skill. They would carefully prepare stone cores, shaping them precisely, then strike off sharp flakes in a controlled sequence. Each core could produce dozens of tools, scrapers, points, knives, all designed for specific purposes. This wasn't random bashing rocks together. This was manufacturing, systematic, efficient, standardized production. They also created the first composite tools in human history. Spear points attached to wooden shafts using birch bark pitch, a natural adhesive that had to be heated to exactly the right temperature to work properly. This means Neanderthals understood chemistry at an intuitive level. They knew how to control fire precisely enough to process natural materials into completely new substances. Their hunting abilities were extraordinary. Analysis of Neanderthal bones shows repeated injuries consistent with close-range combat with large animals. Broken ribs, fractured skulls, shattered limbs. The injury pattern is remarkably similar to modern rodeo riders who get thrown from bulls and horses. This tells us Neanderthals were hunting massive Ice Age mammals, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison up close and personal. Not from a safe distance with projectile weapons, but close enough to get trampled, gored, and crushed. This required incredible courage, but also sophisticated cooperation. You don't take down a mammoth alone. You need a coordinated team, individuals playing specific roles, trusting each other with their lives. This level of social cooperation suggests Neanderthals had complex communication, probably language, definitely shared cultural knowledge, passed down through generations. And then there's the evidence that changed everything we thought we knew about Neanderthals. Burial sites. Starting around 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals began deliberately burying their dead, and just abandoning bodies wherever death occurred, but intentionally digging graves, placing bodies in specific positions, sometimes including what appear to be grave goods, tools, animal bones, even flowers based on pollen analysis from some sites. This is profound. Burial suggests awareness of death as a concept, the ability to think symbolically about existence and non-existence. It implies emotional connections strong enough that survivors felt compelled to honor the deceased. It might even suggest belief in an afterlife, though we can't know for certain. But it doesn't stop there. In recent years, archaeologists have found evidence of Neanderthal art, cave paintings in Spain that predate the arrival of modern humans by tens of thousands of years. Simple geometric patterns, hand stencils, but art nonetheless. Evidence of symbolic thinking, creativity, the desire to leave a mark on the world. There's also evidence they cared for the sick and injured. Neanderthal skeletons show individuals who survived for years with debilitating injuries or illnesses that would have prevented them from hunting or gathering. Someone had to care for these individuals, feed them, protect them, keep them alive. This is compassion. This is humanity in the truest sense. While Neanderthals were adapting to Ice Age Europe, something equally fascinating was happening in Asia. Another branch of the post-Heidelbergensis family tree was diverging in the east. We call them Denisovans, named after Denisons, named after Denis of a cave in Siberia, where their remains were first identified. But here's the thing about Denisovans. We barely know anything about them from fossils. A few teeth, some bone fragments, a piece of a skull. That's it. Everything else we know comes from DNA, and what that DNA tells us is absolutely wild. Denisovans were a distinct human species that split from the lineage leading to Neanderthals around 400,000 years ago. They spread across Asia from Siberia to Southeast Asia, adapting to an incredible range of environments. And we know they were successful because their genes are still here, mixed into modern human populations across Asia and Oceania. Some modern Tibetan populations carry Denisovan gene variants that help them process oxygen efficiently at high altitudes. These aren't random mutations. These are specific genetic adaptations that Denisovans developed over hundreds of thousands of years, living on the roof of the world. When modern humans later moved into Tibet and encountered Denisovans, they interbred, and those ancient altitude adaptations got passed on, helping their descendants thrive in an environment that would otherwise be barely survivable. Pacific Islander populations carry even more Denisov-fed DNA, up to 5% in some groups. This suggests Denisovans had spread all the way to island Southeast Asia, which means they must have been capable seafarers, building boats and navigating open water. This is technology we thought modern humans invented. Turns out our cousins beat us to it. But Denisovans aren't the only mysterious human cousin from this period. On a small island in Indonesia, something even stranger was happening. Around 700,000 years ago, a population of Homo erectus had somehow reached the island of Flores, probably rafting or swimming during a period with low sea levels. Once there, they were trapped. The island was isolated, resources were limited, and evolutions did something it had done before with other island species. It made them smaller. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these isolated Homo erectus descendants shrank. By around 100,000 years ago, they had evolved into a distinct species that stood only about 3.5 feet tall, adult humans the size of modern 4-year-olds. Scientists named them Homo floresensis, but everyone else calls them the hobbits. Don't let the size fool you. These tiny humans had brains only about a third the size of ours, but they were sophisticated tool makers and hunters. Archaeological evidence shows they hunted the island's pygmy elephants and giant rats using stone tools remarkably similar to those made by much larger humans. They controlled fire. They probably had language or at least complex communication. And here's the really incredible part. They survived until about 50,000 years ago, maybe later, while Neanderthals and Denis were thriving across Europe and Asia. While modern humans were preparing to leave Africa, these tiny people were living their lives on a remote island, while completely isolated from the rest of humanity, possibly unaware that any other humans even existed. This paints a very different picture of human evolution than the simple linear progression we used to imagine. Between 200,000 and 40,000 years ago, the planet was home to at least 4 distinct human species, and probably more we haven't discovered yet. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans across Eastern Asia, Homo floresensis on their Indonesian island, and in Africa, a new species was emerging that would eventually outlast them all. Homo sapiens, modern humans. But here's what makes this period so fascinating. These species weren't completely separate. When their ranges overlapped, they interbred. Genetic analysis of modern non-African populations shows we carry 1–2% Neanderthal DNA. Asian populations carry additional Denisov-Feven DNA. Asian populations carry additional Denisov-D/D/C. This interbreeding happened multiple times in multiple locations over tens of thousands of years. Think about what this means. When modern humans finally left Africa around 60,000 years ago, they encountered Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe, and instead of just competing or fighting, at least sometimes they formed relationships. Had children together, created mixed families. Those hybrid children survived, thrived even, and passed on genetic variants that are still with us today. Some of these inherited genes turned out to be useful. Neanderthal gene variants related to skin and hair helped modern humans adapt to the different UV levels in northern latitudes. Immune system genes from both Neanderthals and Denisov-Evans provided resistance to local diseases that would have been devastating to recent African migrants. In a very real sense, interbreeding with our cousin species helped modern humans colonize the world. But it raises profound questions. If we could interbreed successfully, were we really different species? The biological species concept says species are defined by reproductive isolation, the inability to produce fertile offspring. But clearly that barrier wasn't absolute between human species. We were different enough to have evolved distinct physical characteristics and adaptations, but similar enough that our genes were still compatible. Maybe we need to think of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early modern humans not as completely separate species, but as diverging populations of a single, highly variable species. Like dogs, a Chihuahua and a Great Dane look radically different, but they're both the same species because they can theoretically interbreed. Maybe humans 60,000 years ago were like that. Distinct populations that have been separated long enough to look different and develop different adaptations, but not long enough to become reproductively isolated. Whatever the technical definition, by 40,000 years ago, something had changed dramatically. The Neanderthals were disappearing, not everywhere at once, but gradually, their populations declining, their range contracting. The last confirmed Neanderthal sites date to about 40,000 years ago, maybe 35,000 in a few isolated low cations. After 360,000 years of successfully adapting to Ice Age Europe, they were gone. Why? This is one of the biggest mysteries in human evolution, and there's no simple answer. Climate change was definitely a factor. Around 40,000 years ago, the climate was becoming increasingly unstable. Rapid swings between cold and warm periods that would have disrupted the ecosystems Neanderthals depended on. But Neanderthals had survived similar climate changes before. Competition with modern humans was probably part of it. As Homo sapiens populations expanded into Europe, they would have competed for the same resources, hunted the same animals, occupied the same cave shelters. Modern humans had some technological advantages, better projectile weapons that let them hunt from safer distances, more efficient tools that required less raw material. Over time, these small advantages might have added up. Disease is another possibility. When modern humans arrived from Africa, they might have brought new pathogens that Neanderthals had no immunity to. We see this pattern throughout history. When previously isolated populations meet, disease spreads and populations crash. It could have happened to Neanderthals too. But there's another possibility, one that's simultaneously hopeful and sad. Maybe Neanderthals didn't exactly go extinct. Maybe they were assimilated. If Neanderthals and modern humans were interbreeding regularly as our populations overlapped, and if modern humans had higher population numbers, then over generations had higher population numbers, then over generations, the distinct Neanderthal population would have been absorbed into the larger human population. The genes would survive, mixed into the human gene pool, but the distinct Neanderthal culture and physical characteristics would disappear. In this scenario, Neanderthals didn't lose to modern humans. They became modern humans, or at least they became part of us. Every person of non-African descent carries Neanderthal DNA. When you look in the mirror, you're seeing a tiny bit of Neanderthal. Looking back, their genes influence our immune systems, our skin color, even aspects of our mental health and cognitive function. The same is probably true for Denisovans, though they remain successful longer in some regions. The last evidence of Denisov presence comes from around 50,000 years ago, but given how little we know about them, they might have survived much longer in isolated pockets. Homo sensis definitely lasted longer, making it to at least 50,000 years ago, possibly later. But by 40,000 years ago, the age of multiple human species was ending. Modern humans were spreading across the globe, and everywhere we went, other human species disappeared shortly after our arrival. Whether through competition, disease, assimilation, or some combination of all three, the result was the same. One human species remained. Except we're not really a single pure species, are we? We're a hybrid, a mixture of modern human, Neanderthal, Denisovan, and possibly other unknown species. We're the product of hundreds of thousands of years of divergent evolution, followed by tens of thousands of years of recon convergence and genetic mixing. What happened when all those separate evolutionary experiments came back together and merged into something new. And in our DNA, we carry the legacy of all those extinct cousins, the cold adaptations Neanderthals developed, the altitude tolerance Denisovans evolved, the immune resistance multiple species contributed. We're not just descendants of one successful lineage, we're the inheritors of the entire human family tree. All their adaptations, all their survival strategies, all their hard-won genetic knowledge about how to thrive in a challenging world. But this is also the story of loss. The world once held such incredible human diversity. Multiple species, each adapted to different environments, each with their own cultures and technologies and ways of understanding existence. Now there's just us. We're the only ones left, carrying fragments of our cousins in our genes, but unable to meet them, talk to them, learn from them. What would it have been like to meet a Neanderthal? To sit across a fire from someone who is human, but not quite like you, whose mind worked slightly differently, who saw the world through eyes shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution. We'll never know. All we have are bones, tools, DNA sequences, and endless questions about the roads not taken. The alternative ways of being human that flourished for hundreds of millennia before vanishing into the genetic mix that made us. But their story isn't over. Not really, because they're part of our story now. Every time you catch a cold and your immune system fights it off using Neanderthal genes, they're still here. Every time someone climbs to high altitude and their Denisovan-derived genes help them breathe, they're still here. We are them, and they are us, mixed together in ways that can never be untangled. The last representatives of a diverse human family, carrying all their gifts forward into an uncertain future. Around 300,000 years ago, something the rise of Homo sapiens, 300,000 years ago, unprecedented happened in Africa. After millions of years of gradual human evolution, after countless species had risen, adapted, and disappeared, a new kind of human appeared, one that looked, at least superficially, remarkably like you. The first anatomically modern humans emerged somewhere in Africa. We're not entirely sure where. The fossils are scattered, the evidence fragmentary, but we know they were there. In Morocco, at a site called Jebel Errohud, archaeologists found skulls that date back 315,000 years. These weren't quite modern. The faces were a bit more robust, the skulls slightly longer, but they were closer than anything that had come before. In Ethiopia at Omoish, more fossils. These ones dated to 233,000 years ago. More gracile, more refined. The high foreheads, the rounded skulls, the delicate facial bones, all the features that define modern humans, all coming together in a species that was still evolving, still changing, but recognizably us. But here's the thing that's easy to miss. These early Homo sapiens, anatomically modern as they were, weren't behaving like modern humans. Not yet. They had the hardware, the biological equipment, but they hadn't developed the software, the cognitive abilities, the cultural innovations, the symbolic thinking that would eventually make our species dominant across the planet. That transformation would take another 200,000 years, and it would nearly kill us before it saved us. The earliest Homo sapiens were in many ways just another human species. They made stone tools, but so did Neanderthals and other archaic humans. They used fire, but fire had been controlled for hundreds of thousands of years. They lived in small groups, hunted and gathered, survived in the African landscape alongside numerous other species. What made them different? What gave them the potential to eventually dominate the world wasn't immediately obvious. It was locked inside their skulls. Their brains were slightly larger than earlier humans, but more importantly, they were shaped differently. Modern human brains are globular, rounded. This shape seems to correlate with enhanced connectivity between different brain regions, better integration of visual processing, spatial reasoning, and abstract thinking. But potential isn't the same as realization. Having a brain capable of complex language doesn't mean you automatically develop complex language. Having the neural architecture for symbolic thinking doesn't automatically produce art and ritual and religion. Those developments required time, cultural evolution, and most importantly, the right environmental pressures to force innovation. For the first 200,000 years of our species' existence, Homo sapiens remained confined to Africa. They spread across the continent, adapting to different environments. Some lived in coastal regions, learning to exploit marine resources. Others inhabited the savas, perfecting the hunting techniques that had sustained humans for millions of years. Still others moved into forests, mountains, deserts. Each environment demanded different survival strategies, and slowly, generation by generation, our ancestors were becoming more adaptable, more innovative, more capable of solving novel problems. The archaeological record from this period shows something remarkable. Tool technology was evolving, but not in a straight line. Different populations were innovating independently, developing their own solutions to local challenges. In South Africa, people were creating sophisticated stone points, hafting them onto spears with plant resins. In North Africa, different designs, different approaches to the same basic problems. This tells us something crucial. These weren't people mindlessly following ancient traditions. They were experimenting, problem-solving, teaching new techniques to their children. Cultural evolution was happening, but it was slow, localized, uneven. Then, around 195,000 years ago, something started to change. We see the first hints of symbolic behavior in the archaeological record. Not much. A few pieces of ochre with geometric engravings. Some shells deliberately perforated, possibly strung together as jewelry. These might not seem like much, but they represent a cognitive revolution. 2. Create symbols. To make jewelry, you need to understand abstract concepts. A shell isn't just a shell anymore. It's a marker of identity, a sign of status, a beautiful object worth keeping. This is the beginning of symbolic thinking, the ability to let one thing represent another thing. The foundation of language, art, religion, all the complex cultural systems that define modern humanity. But these early expressions were rare, isolated. Most humans were still living much as their ancestors had, focused on the immediate challenges of survival. The real transformation was still to come. Around 74,000 years ago, the world nearly ended, not for everyone, but for Homo sapiens. It came terrifyingly close. Mount Toba, a supervolcano in what's now Indonesia, erupted with a violence that's almost impossible to comprehend. It was the largest volcanic eruption of the past 2 million years. Toba ejected approximately 2,800 kilometers of material into the atmosphere. For comparison, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens ejected about 1 kilometer. The sky went dark. Volcanic ash blanketed vast regions of Africa and Asia. Global temperatures plummeted, possibly by as much as 15 degrees C in some regions. This wasn't just a bad year. This was a volcanic winter that lasted for years, possibly decades. For Homo sapiens, still confined to Africa, the effects were catastrophic. Plant life died back. Animal populations crashed. Water sources dried up or became contaminated with volcanic ash. The carrying capacity of the land plummeted. Genetic evidence suggests that during this period the human population crashed to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. Some estimates put it even lower. We came closer to extinction than most people realize, closer than we've ever come since. Small, scattered groups clinging to whatever refuge they could find. Caves near reliable water sources. Coastal areas where the ocean might buffer some of the temperature extremes. River valleys where plant life recovered more quickly. They weren't all in one place. That would have been suicide. One disease, one local disaster, and the species would have been finished. Instead, they were spread out, maybe groups of 50 or 100, separated by hundreds of miles, connected probably by kinship networks and occasional trade, but living independently enough that no single catastrophe could destroy them all. This created a meta-population structure like the one that had saved our ancestors. During the earlier bottleneck, individual groups going extinct and being replaced, but the overall network surviving. For thousands of years, this desperate situation continued. Some groups found territories with enough resources to thrive, at least temporarily. Others suffered terribly, watching as hunger and disease took their children, The selection pressure was enormous. Only the smartest, the most innovative, the most cooperative group survived. And then something remarkable happened. The volcanic winter ended. The ash settled. The climate began to recover. And the humans who emerged from this near-extinction event were different from those who had entered it. Not genetically, at least not in any obvious way, but culturally, cognitively. They had been transformed. Around 70,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years, we see an explosion of innovation in the archaeological record. Anthropologists call it the Great Leap Forward, though that term is somewhat controversial. Now, some researchers think the changes were more gradual than the term suggests. But regardless of the exact timing, something fundamental changed in how humans behaved. The evidence is everywhere. Stone tool technology suddenly becomes much more sophisticated. We start seeing blade tools, carefully struck flakes, that could be produced rapidly and standardized. Instead of spending hours crafting a hand axe, skilled toolmakers could produce dozens of sharp blades from a single stone core. This is mass production, planned systematic manufacture of interchangeable tools. But tools were just the beginning. Around the same time, we see the first unambiguous evidence of art.
In Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found ochre pieces engraved with complex geometric patterns dated to around 75,000 years ago. These aren't random scratches.
They're deliberate designs, repeating patterns that someone took time and care to create. Why? The patterns serve no practical purpose. They don't make the ochre work better as pigment. They don't improve its functionality in any way. They exist purely as decoration, as expression, as symbols of something we can only guess at. At other sites, we find shells collected from coastal regions and transported hundreds of kilometers inland. Shells that had been deliberately perforated and strung together as beads. This is jewelry, personal adornment, markers of identity. Someone looked at these shells and thought they were beautiful, worth carrying across vast distances, worth the effort of careful preparation. We also start seeing evidence of more sophisticated hunting techniques, projectile weapons, possibly spear throwers, or even early bows that allowed hunters to kill prey from greater distances. Specialized tools for processing different kinds of resources, bone needles for sewing, suggesting the creation of fitted clothing, possibly decorated with those shell beads. More importantly, we see evidence of long-distance and trade networks, raw materials like high-quality stone for toolmaking, ochre for pigment, even special shells prized for jewelry. These materials show up hundreds of km from their sources, indicating extensive exchange networks between different groups. This trade wasn't just about acquiring useful materials. It was social. Every exchange strengthened connections between groups, creating alliances that could be called upon in times of need. If your group suffered a drought or a fire or a disease outbreak, you could relocate to the territory of trading partners, relying on reciprocal obligations built up over generations. The real revolution, though, was happening inside people's heads. All this innovation, all this creativity, all these trade networks and symbolic expressions required something fundamental. Language, not simple communication, which probably existed in some form for millions of years, but complex grammatical, infinitely flexible language. The ability to discuss things that weren't immediately present, to plan for the future, to teach complex procedures, to tell stories about the past. Nobody knows exactly when fully modern language evolved. It doesn't fossilize. We can only infer it from the complexity of the behaviors it enables. But everything about this post-bottleneck period screams sophisticated linguistic ability. The standardized tool tradition suggests detailed verbal instruction. The trade networks imply negotiation and abstract reasoning. The art and jewelry indicate symbolic thinking. That's much easier with words to attach to symbols. Language transforms everything. It allows knowledge to accumulate across generations. Tool-making technique perfected by one person can be taught to others, refined, improved, passed down to children and grandchildren. Cultural evolution can suddenly operate much faster than genetic evolution. With language, humans could share detailed information about distant resources. 3 days walk east past the large baobab tree, There's a water source that flows even in the dry season. Without language, you'd have to discover the water source. Why? Yourself, or follow someone who knew. With language, information spreads at the speed of conversation. With language, humans could plan complex group activities. Tomorrow at dawn, we'll drive the antelope herd toward the cliff, and the hunters will wait at the bottom. Coordinated hunting strategies that required precise timing and role specialization became possible. With language, humans could transmit abstract knowledge. Red ochre mixed with animal fat protects skin from the sun. That plant with the 3-pointed leaves will make you sick. But the similar plant with 5-pointed leaves is safe to eat. Survival information that might take a lifetime to learn. Through trial and error could be taught in an afternoon. Most importantly, with language, humans could tell stories. Stories about ancestors who survived droughts, who discovered new food sources, who solved seemingly impossible problems. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were cultural memory, survival information, encoded in narrative form, passed down through generations. The groups that had survived the Tober bottleneck didn't just have good luck. They had accumulated knowledge, probably including stories about previous climate disasters and how their ancestors had survived them. When the volcanic winter came, that cultural knowledge saved them. They knew where to find refuge, how to preserve food, how to maintain cooperation. When resources became scarce, by 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had become something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Not the fastest species, not the strongest, not the most fertile, but unquestionably the smartest, the most adaptable, the most innovative. They had survived near extinction and emerged with all the cognitive and cultural tools needed to dominate the planet. They had sophisticated language. They had cumulative cultural evolution. They had symbolic thinking that allowed them to create art, religion, and complex social structures. They had technology that was advancing faster than any previous human species had achieved. Most importantly, they had something that would prove decisive in the millennia to come. They had the ability to adapt rapidly to new environments without waiting for genetic evolution. Through cultural innovation, they could move into territories their bodies weren't adapted for and survive anyway. They could invent new tools, new hunting strategies, new social systems as needed. This was the species that was about to leave Africa, not the first human species to do so. Homo erectus had left nearly 2 million years earlier. Neanderthals and were already established across Eurasia. But this time would be different. This time, the humans leaving Africa weren't just another species trying to eke out a living in unfamiliar territories. They were a culture bearing language using innovation, creating species with abilities no previous humans had possessed. They were ready to inherit the Earth. They just didn't know it yet. Global conquest, Homo sapiens, spreads across the world. 10,000,000 years ago. So there they stood, a small group of modern humans on the shores of the Red Sea, staring across the water at Arabia. Behind them, the only continent their species had ever known. Ahead, the entire rest of the world, empty and waiting. This wasn't the first time humans had left Africa. Homo erectus had done it almost 2 million years earlier. Other archaic human populations had wandered out and colonized parts of Europe and Asia. But this time was different. This time, the migrants carried something their predecessors had lacked: the full package of behavioral modernity refined by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in Africa. Advanced language, sophisticated tool-making, abstract reasoning, the ability to plan for the future and learn from the past. They were also lucky. Around 70,000 years ago, sea levels dropped during a glacial period, narrowing the Babel Mandeb Strait between Africa and Arabia to maybe just a few miles. Some groups might have walked across land bridges exposed by the low water. Others probably built simple watercraft, rafts, or boats made from bundled reeds. Either way, they made it. And once they reached Arabia, there was no stopping them. The thing is, they didn't know they were beginning the most successful migration in mammalian history. They were just following the coastline looking for food. Arabia at that time wasn't the desert it is today. During glacial periods, increased rainfall created a green corridor along the coasts. Grasslands and woodlands teeming with game. The migrants moved east generation by generation, following the shores of the Indian Ocean, following the shores of the Indian Ocean. And they moved fast. Within maybe 10,000 years, modern humans had reached Southeast Asia. Archaeological evidence from sites in India, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia shows modern human populations appearing around 60,000 years ago. That's an average migration speed of several miles per year, which might not sound impressive until you remember these weren't organized expeditions. These were small bands of hunter-gatherers, probably 20 to 50 people per group who happened to settle a bit farther east than their parents' generation. Over thousands of years, that gradual drift carried them across an entire continent. But then came something unprecedented. Around 65,000 years ago, modern humans reached the shores of what is now Indonesia and looked out at the ocean and decided to cross it. This is where the story gets truly remarkable. Australia at that time was connected to New Guinea in a single landmass called Seoul, but Seoul was separated from Asia by at least 50 m of open ocean. Even during the lowest sea levels, there was never a land bridge. The only way to reach Australia was by water, deep water, open ocean crossings that would have taken days. This required planning. You don't accidentally float to Australia. You need to build seaworthy boats, gather provisions for the journey, and convince enough people to come with you to establish a viable breeding population on the other side. The archaeological evidence tells us they succeeded. By 65,000 years ago, maybe earlier, modern humans had established settlements across Australia and New Guinea. Think about what this means. These people had developed maritime technology, sophisticated enough for ocean crossings. They had the social organization to plan and execute complex crew projects. They had the language skills to coordinate multi-day voyages with multiple boats, and they had the courage or desperation to set off across water toward lands they couldn't see, trusting that something was out there. They were right. Australia was a paradise, a continent full of animals that had never encountered human hunters, Giant marsupials, the size of rhinos, carnivorous kangaroos, flightless birds, bigger than ostriches. The first Australians hunted them all. And here's where we need to talk about something uncomfortable. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of Australia's megapora went extinct. The giant wombats, the massive marsupial lions, the enormous flightless birds, all gone. This pattern would repeat across the world, wherever modern humans arrived. Megafauna extinctions following shortly after the first human settlers. Was it our fault? The debate continues, but the evidence is pretty damning. Climate change was happening too, which some scientists argue was the real culprit. Climate had fluctuated for millions of years without causing these extinctions. What was different this time was the presence of human hunters with sophisticated weapons, coordinated hunting strategies, and the intelligence to track and kill even the largest animals. We were an invasive species, the most successful predator the world had ever seen. And wherever we went, the largest animals tended to disappear. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. While some modern humans were settling Australia, others were pushing north and west. Around 50,000 years ago, modern human populations began moving into Europe. And there they encountered cousins they hadn't seen in over 400,000 years. And Tubo I am seen in over 400,000 years. The Neanderthals. Now, popular imagination has treated Neanderthals as primitive cavemen, brutish and stupid. This is completely wrong. Neanderthals were sophisticated hunters with complex tools, symbolic culture, and brains actually larger than ours. They had been the dominant human species in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions, but they had also been relatively isolated. Their population was never large, probably a few tens of thousands scattered across Europe and Western Asia. They lived in small groups that occasionally interacted, but were mostly separate. When modern humans arrived with larger population sizes, more extensive trade networks, and possibly superior long-range weapons, the Neanderthals suddenly faced unprecedented competition. What happened next is written in our DNA. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just fight, they also interbred. Genetic analysis shows that most modern humans of European and Asian descent carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA. This means our ancestors and Neanderthals were having children together, hybrid children who survived and contributed to the modern human gene pool. Some of those Neanderthal genes are still doing useful work today. Variants that help us fight certain diseases, adaptations for cold climates. Genes involved in skin and hair color. The Neanderthals might have gone extinct as a distinct species, but parts of them live on in us. But why did they go extinct while we survived? Nobody knows for sure. Maybe we out-competed them for resources. Maybe we had superior technology or better social organization. Maybe we simply had larger populations that could absorb losses and keep growing while Neanderthal populations dwindled. Or maybe it was all of the above, plus bad luck and climate fluctuations that hit Neanderthal populations at exactly the wrong time. By 40,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals were gone. Modern humans had Europe to themselves, and we transformed it. Around 45,000 to 45,000 years ago, something changed in modern human culture. Archaeologists call it the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Though it wasn't really a revolution, more like a flowering, an explosion of creativity and technological innovation that seemed to happen everywhere modern humans settled. Suddenly, the archaeological record fills with art. Cave paintings of stunning sophistication appearing in sites across Europe. The famous paintings at Chauvet Cave in France, created 36,000 years ago, show horses, rhinoceroses, and lions rendered with perspective, shading, and movement. These aren't crude stick figures. They're masterpieces that would look at home in any modern art gallery. Sculpture appears too. Carved figurines, including the famous Venus figurines, small statues of women found across Europe. Musical instruments made from bone, including flutes that could play complex melodies. Decorated weapons and tools, objects that had no practical purpose beyond being beautiful. Why the sudden explosion of artistic expression? Some anthropologists think it reflects the final maturation of human language and symbolic thinking. Others suggest it was driven by population growth creating larger social networks that needed art and ritual to maintain cohesion. Still others think the art was always there, but earlier examples haven't survived or haven't been found. Whatever the cause, the message is clear. By 40,000 years ago, modern humans weren't just surviving. They were creating culture, beauty, meaning. They were asking questions about their place in the world and expressing the answers through art. But they weren't done migrating. The biggest journey was still ahead. Around 20,000 to 15,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere, something remarkable happened. Sea levels dropped so low that a land bridge emerged connecting Asia and Alaska. We call it Bingia, and it was huge, maybe 1,000 miles wide. A completely new landscape of grasslands and tundra, and humans walked across it into the Americas. Or maybe they came by boat following the Pacific coast. Or maybe both. The evidence is still debated. But what's certain is that by 15,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier, modern humans had reached the Americas. And once again, they moved with astonishing speed. Within maybe 2,000 years, human populations had spread from Alaska to Patagonia, over 10,000 m. They crossed mountains, deserts, rainforests, every environment the Americas could throw at them. And at each one, they adapted, developed new technologies, new survival strategies, new cultures. The people who reached the Arctic became specialized hunters of seals and whales, developing sophisticated harpoons and kayaks. Those who settled the Great Plains became expert bison hunters, eventually developing techniques to drive entire herds over cliffs. Groups in the Amazon learned to manage the rainforest, cultivating useful plants, and creating patches of enriched soil that are still visible today. Coastal peoples in the Pacific Northwest became master fishermen and woodworkers, building elaborate houses and totem poles, and once again the megafauna disappeared. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, all gone within a few thousand years of human arrival. The extinction was so rapid and comprehensive that it's hard to blame anything but hunting. We had become the most efficient killers the planet had ever seen, but we were also becoming something else, something unprecedented. We were becoming a truly global species, the first and only animal to inhabit every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth. From the Arctic to the tropics, from deserts to rainforests, from coastal areas to high mountains, humans had figured out how to survive everywhere. And in each environment, we developed distinct cultures, languages, technologies. The diversity of human societies by 10,000 years ago was staggering. Some groups still lived as mobile hunter-gatherers, following game herds or seasonal plant resources. Others had become more sedentary, establishing permanent or semi-permanent settlements near reliable resources. In the Middle East, people were beginning to experiment with something that would change everything. They were starting to domesticate plants and animals. Instead of just hunting wild sheep, they were keeping herds. Instead of just gathering wild grains, they were deliberately planting seeds and tending seeds and tending crops. This was the beginning of agriculture, and it would lead to the most dramatic transformation in human history since the evolution of language. Around 12,000 years ago, multiple groups in different parts of the world independently discovered farming. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, people domesticated wheat, barley, sheep, and goats. In China, rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, corn, beans, and squash. In the Andes, potatoes and lemurs. Agriculture allowed for food. Surpluses, which allowed for larger populations, which allowed for specialization of labor. Some people could focus on growing food while others became craftspeople, merchants, priests, warriors. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities. Social hierarchies emerged. Writing systems developed to keep track of increasingly complex economic and political relationships. Within just a few thousand years after the agricultural revolution, the first civilizations emerged. Sumer in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, along the Nile, the Indus Valley Civilization in Pakistan, the Yellow River Civilization in China, cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants, monumental architecture, writing, organized religion, professional armies. We had gone from a small population of African survivors to a global species, numbering in the millions, living in societies of unprecedented complexity. And we'd done it in just 60,000 years, which in evolutionary terms is the blink of an eye. But we'd also lost something along the way. For most of human evolution, we lived in small egalitarian bands where everyone knew everyone else, where decisions were made collectively and resources shared relatively equally. Where the gap between the richest and poorest was minimal because nobody could accumulate much wealth. Agriculture and civilization changed that. They created hierarchies, inequality, warfare on scales previously impossible. They allowed some people to accumulate enormous wealth and power while others lived in poverty. They created new diseases that spread through dense populations. They tied people to the land in ways that made famine devastating when crops failed. But they also created art, philosophy, science, medicine, literature. They gave us the pyramids and the Parthenon, the works of Homer and the teachings of Buddha, mathematics and astronomy. They created the foundation for everything. Tie, hat would come after, including the modern world we inhabit today. By 10,000 years ago, the age of human evolution through natural selection was essentially over. From this point forward, cultural evolution would dominate. We would change not through genetic adaptation, but through the accumulation and transmission of knowledge, technology, and social innovations. The hunter-gatherers who crossed into Australia, who painted caves in Europe, who walked to the tip of South America, they were biologically identical to us. Same brains, same bodies, same genetic potential. The only difference is the knowledge they inherited from their culture versus what we inherit from ours. We had conquered the world. Every continent except Antarctica was home to human populations. Every environment had been mastered, every challenge overcome. We were no longer just another species struggling to survive. We were the dominant force on the planet, for better and worse. The question now was what we would do with that dominance. That story is still being written, and here we are. Conclusion. Reflecting on our remarkable journey, the end of the story. Except it's not really the end, is it? Because you're here listening to this, carrying in yourselves the entire history we've just traveled through. Think about what we've covered. 65 million years ago, your ancestors were tiny shrews hiding from dinosaurs. They were barely mammals, just small, furry things, trying not to get stepped on. Fast forward to 7 million years ago, and they become apes living in African forests, swinging through trees, eating fruit, living simple lives that could have continued unchanged for millions more years. But then, something shifted. Climate change forced some of them down from the trees. They started walking upright not because it was better, but because the forests were disappearing, and they needed to survive in open grasslands. That single adaptation, standing on two legs, freed their hands, and free hands meant tools. Tools meant bigger brains meant more complex thinking. More complex thinking meant language, culture, civilization. But it wasn't a straight line. It never is with evolution. For millions of years, there were multiple human species walking the earth simultaneously. Auropithecus in the woodlands, Homo erectus spreading across Asia, Neanderthals dominating Ice Age Europe, Denisovans adapting to the high plateaus, and island of Asia. And then there was us, Homo sapiens, the late arrivals who somehow outlasted everyone else. We weren't the strongest. Neanderthals were more robust. We weren't the most cold adapted. We weren't the first to use fire or make tools or even leave Africa. So what made the difference? Why are we the ones telling the story instead of Neanderthals or Denisovans? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to a unique combination of traits that had never existed together in any species before. We had big brains, but so did Neanderthals. We used tools, but so did Homo erectus. We were social, but so were all primates. What made us different was having all of these things together, plus something extra. Behavioral flexibility, the ability to adapt our culture faster than our genes could evolve. When Homo sapiens encountered a new environment, we didn't wait thousands of generations for natural selection to adapt us. We invented new tools, developed new hunting strategies, created new social systems. We could become Arctic hunters in Siberia, desert nomads in Arabia, island seafarers in Polynesia, all within a few thousand years, same species, same basic biology, but radically different cultures and survival strategies.
That flexibility came from language, from our enhanced capacity for symbolic thinking, from social systems that
could preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. We didn't just survive, we created elaborate mental models of the world. We told stories, we made art, we buried our dead with ceremony. We wondered about stars and storms and what happens after we die. We became the first species in Earth's history to ask why about everything. But here's what's really wild, we're still evolving. Right now, this very moment. Evolution didn't stop when we invented agriculture or built cities or developed modern medicine. It just changed direction. Some human populations have evolved lactose tolerance in just the last 10,000 years because they started hearing dairy animals. Others developed resistance to malaria through genetic mutations that also cause sickle cell anemia. Tibetan populations have Denisov-Vivan genes that help them live at high altitudes. The average human skull shape has changed noticeably in just the last few centuries, probably because our diets became softer with agriculture. We're even evolving in response to modern life. Studies suggest that women in developed countries are having children earlier on average than their grandmothers did, not because of social changes, but because of actual selection for genes associated with earlier reproduction. And the future, nobody knows. We've taken control of our environment to such an extent that traditional natural selection barely applies anymore. We've developed technologies that let us edit genes directly, potentially bypassing evolution entirely. We're merging with our tools in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. Maybe in another million years, if there are still beings descended from us, they'll look back at us the way we look at Homo erectus, primitive, struggling with problems that seem trivial to them, but doing our best with what we had. The whole journey from tree shrews to space stations took about 65 million years. But the really dramatic changes, the ones that made us human, happened in just the last 2 or 3 million. And the changes that created modern civilization happened in just the last 10,000 years. We're accelerating. Where we'll go next is anybody's guess. But understanding where we came from, That's crucial. Every challenge we face today, from climate change to social inequality to questions about what makes life meaningful, those challenges are shaped by our evolutionary history. We're still carrying the instincts of savanna primates, the survival drives of bottleneck survivors, the tribal loyalties that helped our ancestors cooperate in small groups. Knowing that doesn't solve our problems, but it helps us understand them. It reminds us that we're not separate from nature. We are nature, just nature that learned to tell stories about itself. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've traveled through 65 million years of evolutionary history. If you enjoyed this journey, hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what surprised you most about our evolutionary story, and subscribe, because there's always more history to explore. Now, get some sleep. You've earned it. You've just walked through millions of years. Rest well, descended of survivors. Rest well, descended of survivors.